"May I hide here till the outlaws pass?" a Lakota maiden asked, trembling. The rancher just nodded. "Yes, hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much." Aiyana, a young Lakota woman, stumbled through the dense prairie grass, her heart racing with each heavy step. The sounds of pursuit were fading, but she knew they were still out there. Outlaws, cruel men who hunted like wolves, their eyes set on her and her tribe. Her breath came in ragged bursts, and her legs, exhausted from hours of running, burned with the effort. She had been forced to flee from her home when she overheard their plans. Plans that would have meant death or worse for her people. As the wind howled through the tall grass, Aiyana could feel the weight of her desperation, the fear gnawing at her as she searched for refuge. She knew she couldn't keep running. Her body was giving out, and the outlaws were close. They would find her soon unless she could find a place to hide, somewhere she could remain unseen, just long enough for them to pass by. Through the blur of fear and exhaustion, Aiyana spotted a small, weathered cabin in the distance. She staggered towards it, praying it wasn't another trap, but her hope was all she had left. Her eyes scanned the surroundings, searching for any signs of danger, but all she saw was the quiet solitude of the land. With every step, her strength drained further, until, finally, she arrived at the door. She didn't knock. Instead, she stood there, breathless and trembling, and whispered, "May I hide here till the outlaws pass?" She didn't know what to expect. But then, from the darkness within, a voice answered, calm yet firm. "Come in." It was a voice unlike any she had heard before, deep, rich, and filled with an unexpected calm. Aiyana hesitated, wondering who this person was, and if she could truly trust him. But in that moment, her body couldn't take another step. She pushed the door open, stumbled inside, and collapsed against the wooden frame. The door shut quietly behind her. As she lay on the cold wooden floor, her heart racing, she felt a strange sense of safety for the first time in hours. But who was this man who had allowed her to enter? And why had he chosen to help a stranger in such a dangerous time? Aiyana closed her eyes, listening to the sound of the wind outside, praying that, for once, fate would be kind to her. She had no idea how much her life was about to change in this simple act of hiding. The rancher who had allowed her in was no ordinary man. And as the night wore on, secrets would unravel, and the bonds between them would be tested in ways neither of them could foresee. But for now, all she could do was rest, knowing that for a fleeting moment, she was safe. The warmth of the fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows against the rustic wooden walls of the cabin. Aiyana, still shaken from her flight, sat in the corner, trying to steady her breath. Her mind raced with thoughts of the outlaws and the chaos she had narrowly escaped. She was safe, at least for now, but she knew it was only a matter of time before they started searching for her. Her gaze shifted toward the rancher, the man who had taken her in. He was sitting at a table across the room, calmly sharpening a knife, his posture relaxed, but his eyes never leaving her. There was an air of quiet authority about him, one that made Aiyana uneasy but strangely comforted at the same time. The sound of the storm howling outside reminded her that she was far from safe, and yet, in this moment, with the rancher nearby, she felt something she hadn't felt in days: peace. The tension between them was palpable, but it was a tension that had not yet been broken. She didn't know who he was, or why he had chosen to help her, but she couldn't bring herself to ask. His silence was his shield, and she respected it. "You can stay here until the storm passes," he finally said, his voice low but steady. "I'll make sure the outlaws don't find you." Aiyana's heart skipped a beat at the promise. She had never known a stranger to offer such help without expecting something in return. She looked at him, studying his face, trying to read his intentions. His features were rugged, his hands calloused from years of labor. He was a man used to the land, to survival, and something in the way he spoke made her believe he was not a man who broke promises. Yet, something about him remained guarded, distant, as if his past weighed heavily on him. Aiyana couldn't help but feel that his kindness was a mask, a facade hiding something deeper. She shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. The rancher stood up and moved toward the window, peering outside at the raging storm. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon, as though looking for something or someone. Aiyana, still too exhausted to speak, watched him, trying to make sense of the situation. She had been running for so long, her body and mind worn thin, but in this cabin, with the storm closing in, she felt an odd sense of safety. Perhaps it was just the exhaustion, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this place was more than just a refuge. It was a crossroads, and for the first time in a long time, she was forced to confront the question that had been lingering in her mind ever since she ran. What was she running from? She had never truly considered what would happen if she stopped fleeing. The outlaws were a part of it, yes, but there was something else. Aiyana had lived through years of violence and hardship, first at the hands of the settlers, then at the brutal treatment of her own people. She had learned to trust no one, to hide her true self from the world. Yet here, in the presence of this rancher, she felt an unexpected stirring in her chest, something akin to hope, something she had long abandoned. "You're not what I expected," she said, breaking the silence. The rancher turned, his gaze locking with hers. His eyes softened, just for a moment, before he turned back to the window. "Most people aren't," he replied. Aiyana frowned, not understanding the cryptic response. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer right away, and Aiyana wondered if he would at all. The silence stretched between them like an endless chasm. Finally he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "Because I know what it's like to be alone." The words struck her like a physical blow. Aiyana's breath caught in her throat as she realized the depth of what he had said. This man, this rancher, had suffered too. He understood loss, understood pain, and somehow, that made him more human in her eyes than anyone she had ever met. She didn't know why, but in that moment, she felt an unexpected connection to him, one born not of fear or necessity, but of shared experience. Aiyana didn't know what to say. She wasn't sure if she even had the words to express the gratitude she felt. Instead, she simply nodded, acknowledging the bond that had silently formed between them. The storm raged on outside, but within the walls of the cabin, a strange sense of calm had settled. They were two souls, trapped by circumstance, yet bound by something more profound. For a fleeting moment, Aiyana allowed herself to close her eyes and imagine a life where she wasn't running, where she wasn't hiding. It was a dangerous thought, one that she quickly pushed aside. She had no illusions about what the world would offer her. There was only survival, and the rancher had offered her that. For now, that was enough. In the dim light of the cabin, the storm outside howled louder than ever, the wind beating against the walls with an almost violent force. Aiyana sat by the fire, her eyes fixed on the flickering flames, her thoughts swirling like the tempest outside. The rancher had made good on his promise. He had kept her safe for now, but there was an undeniable tension between them, unspoken yet ever-present. She didn't know how long she could stay hidden here, especially as the days passed, and the outlaws would surely continue their search. She had escaped them for now, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this brief peace wouldn't last. The rancher had been kind, but he was a man of few words, and Aiyana sensed there was more to him than met the eye. He wasn't just a simple farmer. There was a strength in him, something deep and unyielding, something that mirrored the hard land they lived on. Aiyana, still unsure of her place here, looked across the room at him. He had been preparing supplies for the storm's aftermath, sharpening tools and organizing his small collection of gear, all with quiet efficiency. His hands were strong and steady, movements deliberate, as if every task was an extension of something much larger than the mundane act of survival. She couldn't help but wonder what had brought him to this place, why he chose to live in isolation, far from the nearest town or settlement. He didn't strike her as a man who had run away from something, but rather a man who had been shaped by the land and whatever battles he had fought along the way. After a long moment, he turned to her, catching her gaze. There was no anger, no judgment, just a calm that seemed to hold the weight of years lived alone. "You're not what I expected either," he said, his voice low but even. Aiyana blinked, taken aback. She had no idea how to respond. She had never met someone who seemed so unfazed by her presence, as if her past, her identity, didn't matter. "What did you expect?" she asked quietly, her curiosity getting the better of her. The rancher paused, his eyes lingering on hers for a moment before he spoke. Someone running, desperate, afraid. You don't look like someone who's lost. His words struck her, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. She wasn't running out of fear, not anymore. She had been running for so long. But here, with this stranger, the weight of it all seemed to lift just a little. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like prey. The rancher's gaze softened as if he could sense the shift in her. You're safe here for now, he said. But you'll need to keep moving when the storm clears. Aiyana nodded, knowing the truth of his words. She couldn't stay here forever. The outlaws would be back, and she couldn't afford to grow complacent. She had to stay vigilant. But for now, she would rest. She would allow herself to rest. Thank you, she said, the words simple but sincere. The rancher gave a slight nod, turning back to his work. The tension between them had shifted, but it wasn't gone. She could still feel the distance in his silence, the unspoken things he wasn't ready to share. She respected that, and she had no intention of pushing him. They were both survivors in this unforgiving land, bound by circumstances more than anything else. As the night wore on, the storm raged outside, but inside, the warmth of the fire and the presence of the rancher made the cabin feel like a temporary sanctuary. It was the first time in days that Aiyana had allowed herself to believe in something other than survival. She closed her eyes, exhaustion finally taking its toll. The storm would pass, and when it did, so would her time here. But for tonight, she was safe, and that would have to be enough. In the quiet that followed the storm, Aiyana awoke to the faint glow of early morning light filtering through the cabin's small window. The wind had died down, leaving only the soft whispers of nature outside. The fire had dwindled to embers, and the rancher had already risen, his silhouette outlined by the pale light as he moved about the room. Aiyana stretched her stiff muscles, feeling the weight of the last few days settle on her. She had been running, hiding, and surviving, but now, in the aftermath of the storm, she faced a choice. Should she continue her flight, or would she find a way to stand her ground? She could feel the uncertainty deep in her bones, and yet, for the first time in a long while, she found herself reluctant to leave the safety of this cabin. The rancher didn't speak as he worked, his movements methodical, as if he had done this countless times before. Aiyana watched him, wondering if he felt the same conflict that she did. Was he truly indifferent, or was there something he was keeping from her? As he turned to face her, their eyes met, and she saw something shift in his gaze, something softer, more human. He didn't speak at first, but his expression was enough. You should get ready to leave, he said finally, his voice carrying an edge of finality. But Aiyana, feeling a surge of emotion she didn't fully understand, stood up and faced him. Why? She asked, her voice steady despite the rush of feelings inside her. You're not going to turn me away, are you? The rancher's eyes narrowed slightly, his jaw tightening. You don't belong here, he said, though there was no harshness in his tone, just a quiet certainty. This is no place for you to stay long. Aiyana's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she felt the sting of rejection. But she held her ground. I'm not asking for much, she said, her voice low but firm. Just a little more time. Just a few more days. The rancher was silent for a long moment, the weight of his thoughts pressing on him. Finally, he let out a sigh and nodded, though his face remained unreadable. You can stay a little longer. But not forever. There's no future for you here. Aiyana's heart twisted. She had known this was only temporary. But there was a part of her that wished it could be different. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe, like she could exist without the constant fear of being hunted. But she understood. This wasn't her life, not really. She couldn't stay hidden away in a cabin forever. As she prepared to leave, the rancher made no move to stop her. She wasn't sure if that meant he truly wanted her to go, or if he simply didn't care. He had already offered her a refuge in the storm, and that was more than most people would have done. She stepped toward the door, her feet heavy with the weight of what was to come. The world beyond the cabin was still dangerous. The outlaws would return eventually. But she was different now, changed by this fleeting moment of safety. As Aiyana opened the door and stepped into the cool morning air, the rancher called after her, his voice rougher than before. If you're going, go quickly. They won't be far behind. She didn't look back, but the words hung in the air, a reminder of the world she had left behind and the one she had to face. She was free, for now, but she was still a fugitive. As Aiyana walked away from the cabin, she couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would she keep running, or would she find a way to stand and fight? Her heart was heavy with uncertainty, but she knew one thing for sure. She would never forget the kindness the rancher had shown her, and the refuge he had offered, even if it was only for a brief moment in time. The morning light barely touched the horizon as Aiyana moved through the tall grass, her heart pounding with every step. The rancher's words echoed in her mind, a steady reminder that the safety she had found was fleeting. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay. The storm had passed, and the world outside was waiting, just as dangerous as it had been before. She glanced over her shoulder, toward the cabin where she had spent the night, a place that had felt like a brief sanctuary from the chaos of her life. The rancher had been kind, but kindness in a place like this never lasted. The outlaws would return. The uncertainty of the future pressed down on her shoulders, heavy and suffocating. She kept moving, each step a mixture of hope and fear, not knowing where the path would lead her, only that she had to keep going. Her instincts, honed by years of surviving on the run, told her to keep her distance from everyone. People, no matter how kind, only brought trouble. Aiyana had learned that the hard way. She had learned that the world didn't care for people like her. People who didn't belong anywhere. People who were always looking over their shoulders. Her family was gone, her people scattered, and she had been running for years, ever since the world had torn her life apart. But as she walked away from the cabin, a strange feeling settled in her chest, a feeling she hadn't felt in a long time: uncertainty. What if she didn't have to keep running? What if there was a place for her here, in this strange land? She shook the thought from her mind, forcing herself to focus. She couldn't afford to entertain fantasies. The world was harsh, and it always would be. She didn't have time for anything other than survival. As the sun climbed higher, she found herself at the edge of the ranch, staring out at the open land stretching before her. It was wild and untamed, but there was something about it that called to her, something she couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the isolation, the freedom, or perhaps it was the faint hope that she could carve out a place for herself in a world that seemed to offer none. The sound of hooves in the distance broke her thoughts, and she froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife at her side. She crouched low, her heart racing, watching the riders approach. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the figures. 2 men on horseback, moving slowly and deliberately. They were the outlaws. They had found her. She couldn't stay here. She had to run. Without thinking, she turned and sprinted toward the forest, her legs burning as she pushed herself harder than she ever had before. The outlaws would be on her in minutes if she didn't make it to cover. As she reached the tree line, she risked a glance over her shoulder and saw them, still a distance away, but gaining ground. Panic surged through her, and she pushed herself harder, weaving through the trees, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She couldn't hear them anymore, but that didn't mean they weren't there. They were skilled trackers, and they would find her if she wasn't careful. Her mind raced, calculating the distance, the direction, anything that would give her an edge. She couldn't do this alone. She needed help. The thought came like a lightning strike, and for the first time since she had started running, she considered turning back. But turning back would mean risking everything. The safety she had found, the brief peace, the chance at something better. She couldn't. She wouldn't. But just as the despair began to take root, something unexpected happened. A figure appeared in front of her, stepping out from behind a large rock. She skidded to a halt, her hand instinctively reaching for her knife again. The figure didn't move, didn't threaten her. Aiyana's heart raced as she recognized the rancher. He stood tall and calm, his eyes fixed on her, the same quiet strength in his posture that had been there the night before. "They're behind you," he said simply. "I'll take care of them." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She couldn't believe it. She had known he was different, but this? She had never expected him to risk his life for her. He wasn't just offering her shelter, he was offering to fight for her. The realization hit her harder than she expected, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something stir inside her: hope. But she quickly pushed it down. She didn't deserve this. She had no place here, not in this man's life, not in this world. Yet, as the rancher nodded at her, the storm inside her began to settle. She had a choice to make: keep running or face what was coming. She knew that whatever happened next would change everything. The sound of hooves pounding the earth grew louder as the rancher turned to face the oncoming riders. Aiyana stood frozen for a moment, her heart hammering in her chest as she watched him prepare. He was calm, eerily calm, despite the danger that loomed just behind them. For a moment, she considered running again, leaving him to face the outlaws on his own. But the thought of turning her back on someone who had protected her, someone who had shown her kindness when she thought none would come, made her hesitate. The rancher looked over his shoulder briefly, his eyes meeting hers, as if silently telling her to stay hidden. Without a word, he stepped forward, his boots crunching against the dry earth. Aiyana watched in disbelief as he faced the outlaws, who had now come into view. They were riding hard, their faces set with a dangerous intent. There were 4 of them, all armed and looking as though they had seen their share of violence. The rancher didn't flinch. He didn't even reach for a weapon. Instead, he stood tall, his gaze unwavering as the outlaws slowed their horses to a halt. Aiyana could barely make out their words, but the hostility in their tone was unmistakable. "You've got something we want," one of the outlaws said, his voice rough and demanding. "The girl. She's ours." The rancher didn't move. He didn't acknowledge the threat, but the air around him seemed to thicken with tension. Aiyana's breath caught in her throat as she realized just how much danger the rancher was in. She had no idea what he was thinking or planning, but she knew one thing: he wasn't afraid. The rancher's voice broke the silence, low and steady. "You're not taking her," he said, his words carrying the weight of someone who had nothing left to lose. The outlaws laughed, their arrogance clear as they dismounted and advanced toward him. Aiyana's heart raced, fear clenching in her chest. She wanted to do something, anything, to help him, but she was frozen in place. The rancher didn't flinch as the first outlaw reached for his gun. With lightning speed, the rancher moved, his body a blur as. He disarmed the man and knocked him to the ground. Aiyana gasped, her eyes wide in shock. She had never seen anyone move like that, so precise, so deadly. The other outlaws hesitated, surprise flashing across their faces as they took a step back. But they quickly recovered, reaching for their weapons. The rancher's eyes narrowed, his stance solid as he prepared for the next move. Aiyana didn't know what to do. She couldn't stay hidden forever. But the rancher had already made his choice, and it was too late for her to leave. With a sudden burst of courage, she stepped out from behind the tree and rushed toward him. "Wait," she called, her voice shaky but determined. The rancher glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Stay back," he ordered, his tone firm. But Aiyana didn't listen. She moved closer, her eyes locked on the outlaws who were now circling him like wolves. She had seen enough violence in her life to know what it meant when men like this were involved. They didn't just want her, they wanted him, too. And she couldn't let that happen. She wasn't going to run anymore. She was going to fight. The rancher seemed to sense her determination. His gaze softened for a moment, just a flicker, before he nodded. "Get behind me," he said quietly, his voice like gravel. "You'll be safer there." Aiyana didn't hesitate. She moved quickly, positioning herself just behind him, her hands trembling at her sides. The rancher stood tall, facing the outlaws with a cold, unwavering focus. The standoff stretched on, tense and drawn out. Aiyana could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she stood firm. The first outlaw lunged forward, pulling his knife from his belt. But before he could strike, the rancher was there, his movements swift and precise. The outlaw never stood a chance. The rancher's fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling to the ground. Aiyana's breath caught in her throat as she watched, the force of the punch more brutal than anything she had ever seen. The remaining outlaws, now wary, took a step back. They had underestimated him, and now they realized their mistake. The rancher didn't move, his gaze unflinching as he surveyed the remaining threats. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint scent of rain. The moment was charged with electricity, the tension thick in the air. And then, as if the storm itself had reached a boiling point, the outlaws made their move. With a roar, they charged forward, guns drawn. Aiyana's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea what was going to happen next. But she knew one thing for sure. The rancher was fighting for her, and that meant everything. The outlaws came at him fast, their movements coordinated, but the rancher stood his ground. The first shot rang out, a deafening crack that split the air. Aiyana ducked behind a nearby boulder, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath shallow. She could hear the sound of hooves, the shouts of the outlaws, but she couldn't see the rancher anymore. The tension in the air was unbearable. She had to do something. She couldn't just hide. She needed to fight, to help him. She looked around quickly, her eyes scanning the area for anything she could use. A rifle, a rock, anything. Her eyes fell on a loose branch nearby. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. She grabbed it quickly, her hands shaking, and started moving toward the action. The rancher had already disarmed one of the outlaws, sending him crashing to the ground with a punch that seemed to have knocked the wind out of him. But the others were still coming, guns drawn, ready to finish what they had started. The rancher moved like a man who had done this before, his every move calculated, precise. He ducked behind a tree, narrowly avoiding another shot, and then sprang from cover, knocking another outlaw to the ground with a swift kick to the chest. Aiyana couldn't help but be in awe of him. He was nothing like the men she had known before. He was strong, fierce, and above all, he was protecting her. The outlaws regrouped, realizing that they were losing control of the situation. They hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether they should continue or retreat. It was in that moment of uncertainty that Aiyana seized her chance. She sprinted forward, her heart racing, the branch in her hands like a weapon. She swung it at the nearest outlaw, catching him off guard and sending him stumbling backward. The rancher glanced over at her, his eyes flicking with surprise, but he didn't miss a beat. He charged forward, taking down another outlaw with a quick, decisive move. The remaining two outlaws looked at each other, panic creeping into their expressions. They hadn't expected this, hadn't counted on a woman fighting back, especially not one who had been running for her life. Aiyana could see the doubt in their eyes. They weren't prepared for a fight like this. They had thought they were the ones in control, but now, the balance had shifted. One of the outlaws made a break for it, turning his horse and riding hard toward the horizon. The rancher moved to pursue, but Aiyana stopped him with a hand on his arm. "Let him go," she said, her voice strong despite the fear that still lingered. "We've won. Let him run." The rancher looked at her for a moment, then nodded. He didn't argue. Instead, he turned back to the other outlaw, who was slowly getting to his feet. Aiyana took a step forward, raising the branch in her hands as if to strike again, but the outlaw held up his hands in surrender. "I'm done," he muttered, fear evident in his voice. "I'll leave. Just don't kill me." The rancher stepped toward him, his face expressionless, his eyes cold. "You should have thought of that before," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Now get out of here, and don't come back." The outlaw nodded quickly, scrambling to get on his horse and riding off in the same direction as his companion. Aiyana exhaled, her body shaking from the adrenaline that had coursed through her veins. It was over. For now, at least. She looked at the rancher, who was already gathering the weapons from the fallen men. He didn't speak, just moved with a quiet efficiency that told her this wasn't the first time he had dealt with men like this. Aiyana's heart was still racing, but there was something else now, a feeling of gratitude mixed with something deeper, something she couldn't quite place. The rancher had risked his life for her. He had fought for her. She had never known anyone who had done that before. She took a step closer to him, her eyes searching his face for some sign of what to do next. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly, her voice catching in her throat. "I could have kept running." The rancher paused for a moment, looking at her as if considering his response. Then he spoke, his voice soft but filled with an unspoken strength. "Sometimes, running isn't enough." Aiyana didn't know how to respond to that. She had spent so long running, so long hiding, that the idea of standing and facing the world head-on was foreign to her. But in this moment, with the rancher standing beside her, she felt something shift. She didn't have to run anymore. Maybe, for the first time in her life, she could fight back. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a place in this world where she didn't have to be afraid anymore. The rancher gave her a brief nod, as if sensing the change in her. He turned away, collecting the last of the fallen weapons, and Aiyana followed him, unsure of where the road ahead would take her, but feeling, for the first time in years, a glimmer of hope. The rancher and Aiyana moved quickly through the trees, their footsteps muffled by the thick underbrush. The outlaws were gone, but the danger had not passed. Aiyana could still feel the tension in her chest, the heavy weight of what had just happened. She had never been in a fight like that before, had never faced men with guns who would do anything to get what they wanted. But the rancher had been there. He had protected her. He had fought for her. And now, as they walked in the quiet aftermath, something inside Aiyana stirred. She wasn't sure what it was, but it felt like the first step toward something new. They reached the cabin, and Aiyana paused for a moment before stepping inside. The rancher had already gone in, but Aiyana lingered just outside, her thoughts swirling. She had always been on the run, always moving, always looking over her shoulder. But now, for the first time in a long while, she felt like she could stop. She could stay. She didn't have to run anymore. The rancher's voice broke through her thoughts. "Come inside. We need to get things ready before nightfall." Aiyana nodded and stepped inside. The fire was still warm, crackling softly in the hearth. She watched the rancher as he moved around the cabin, gathering supplies, preparing for whatever might come next. There was something steady about him, something unshakable. It was clear he had been living like this for a long time, but it was also clear that he was no stranger to danger. Aiyana sat down near the fire, the heat warming her chilled skin. She felt a deep sense of gratitude for this man, for the safety he had offered her. But there was still so much she didn't know. Why had he helped her? Why had he risked his life for someone he barely knew? She couldn't stop herself from asking. "Why did you do it?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The rancher paused, his back to her. He didn't answer immediately, and Aiyana wondered if he even heard her. But then he turned slowly, his gaze meeting hers. "I didn't want you to die," he said simply. "I didn't want anyone to die. It's just who I am." Aiyana didn't know what to say. She had been prepared to face the world alone, but this man had changed everything. She had never known someone who would fight for her, someone who would stand in front of danger without hesitation. She had always been the one who had to protect herself. She had always been the one running from the past. But now, as she sat there in the warmth of the cabin, with the rancher standing just a few feet away, she felt something shift inside her. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was the idea that, for the first time in a long time, she didn't have to do everything on her own. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "You didn't have to do that." The rancher gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I did." He turned back to his task, but Aiyana could see the tension in his shoulders, the weariness that clung to him despite his calm demeanor. She stood up and walked over to him, her movements slow but deliberate. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice steady, but the uncertainty in her heart clear. The rancher looked at her again, his eyes thoughtful. "Now we wait," he said. "We wait until we're sure it's safe. And then we figure out what to do next." Aiyana nodded. It was simple, but it was enough. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone. She wasn't running. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. As the day wore on, they worked together, gathering what they could, securing the cabin, and preparing for whatever the night might bring. The wind outside had picked up again, but inside the cabin, there was a sense of quiet that Aiyana had never known. It was a peace she had never thought possible, a peace she hadn't even realized she was searching for. When night fell, the fire was still crackling in the hearth, casting long shadows on the walls. Aiyana and the rancher sat in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. But as the hours passed, Aiyana felt a shift inside her. The fear that had been a constant companion for so long was slowly being replaced by something else, something that felt like hope. She wasn't sure where the road ahead would lead, but for the first time, she didn't feel so alone. And that, more than anything, was a comfort. The storm had passed, the outlaws had been dealt with, and for now, they were safe. But Aiyana knew the peace wouldn't last forever. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing. She wasn't running anymore. She had a choice now, and for the first time in her life, she was going to face it head on. The morning came slowly, with light spilling over the edge of the horizon, spilling like a soft promise through the cracks of the cabin's rough-hewn walls. Aiyana woke up, the warmth of the fire still lingering in the room, but the feeling of peace that had settled over her the night before was already starting to fade. She sat up on the floor, her eyes slowly adjusting to the daylight as she rubbed the sleep from her face. The storm had passed, but the unease in her heart remained. The rancher was already up, moving quietly around the cabin as he gathered his things, preparing for the day ahead. She knew the time had come to make a choice, to face the reality of what they had done and what was yet to come. "What now?" she asked, her voice still thick with sleep, but the words heavy with the weight of the question. The rancher glanced over his shoulder, offering a brief nod in acknowledgement. His movements were precise, as if he knew exactly what had to be done, and his quiet confidence only made Aiyana feel more unsure of her next step. "Now we prepare," he said simply, his voice calm but firm. "We can't stay here forever." Aiyana stood, stretching out her stiff limbs, the weight of his words sinking in. She had known this day would come, the day when she would have to leave, when the safety of the cabin would no longer be enough. But she hadn't been prepared for how it would feel to walk away from this place, from the quiet peace they had shared. She glanced out the window, taking in the land that stretched beyond the cabin, wild, untamed, and filled with the promise of freedom, but also danger. She wasn't sure if she was ready to leave this place behind, to face whatever lay ahead, but she knew she had no choice. The world outside wasn't kind to people like her, and staying in one place for too long was never an option. The rancher moved to the door, his coat pulled tight against the morning chill, and Aiyana followed him, stepping out into the crisp air. The land was quiet now, with only the rustling of leaves and the distant sound of a bird calling into the vast sky. "The outlaws will be back," the rancher said, his voice steady, as though he had been anticipating this moment. "And when they come, they won't stop until they find you." Aiyana looked at him, her gaze soft but firm. She didn't want to run anymore. She didn't want to be afraid, always looking over her shoulder, always hiding. But she also knew the reality of her situation. She couldn't ignore the danger. "I don't want to run," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "I don't want to live like this anymore." The rancher nodded, his expression unreadable. "Then we fight," he said simply. "But only when we're ready. We'll need to plan." Aiyana didn't know if she was ready for a fight. She had spent so many years surviving, so many years running, that the idea of standing her ground felt foreign, almost impossible. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that running wasn't an option anymore. She had already given up too much, lost too much to just turn and flee again. The rancher turned to face her, his eyes steady and sure. "If you're ready to fight, you'll need to learn how to stand on your own," he said, his words serious but not harsh. "I can teach you, but you'll have to want it. You'll have to be willing to face what comes." Aiyana looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know if she was ready to fight, but she knew one thing. She couldn't keep living in fear. She couldn't keep running. "Teach me," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. The rancher gave her a small, approving nod. He turned and began walking toward the small shed at the edge of the property. Aiyana followed him, her feet heavy with the weight of what was to come. She didn't know how long it would take or what the outcome would be, but she was ready to face it. They had to prepare. There was no other choice. The rancher stopped at the door of the shed and turned to look at her. "This won't be easy," he said, his tone low, almost a warning. "But if you're ready, you'll learn. You'll learn how to fight, how to survive, and maybe you'll learn how to live without fear." Aiyana nodded. It wouldn't be easy, but she was done running. She was done hiding. It was time to face whatever came next. She stepped forward, ready to begin the next chapter of her life, no matter how difficult or dangerous it might be. She was ready to fight, and she was ready to live. The days passed in a quiet, deliberate rhythm as Aiyana trained with the rancher. Each morning, the sun rose slowly over the horizon, and they would spend the hours before midday preparing, learning, and practicing. The rancher taught her how to move with precision, how to read the land around her, how to stay still and listen for the sounds that most would ignore. He taught her how to handle a weapon, how to aim, how to fire, and how to stay alive. Aiyana's body ached with each day's lesson, but it was a good pain. It was the pain of growth, the pain of something new. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was gaining control, like she wasn't just surviving, but learning to thrive. Yet, despite the progress, something remained unspoken between them. There was a distance, a line neither of them crossed. The rancher was a man of few words, and Aiyana respected that. But there was a growing ache in her chest, a longing for something more. She couldn't help but notice the moments when his gaze softened, when their hands brushed as they worked together, when his eyes lingered just a second longer than necessary. But she said nothing. She was still running, still hiding from the world. The rancher wasn't a part of that world, and she couldn't afford to let him become part of her escape. But the truth was, Aiyana was changing. The more she trained, the more she understood. She wasn't just learning how to survive the next fight. She was learning how to live without fear. And that, more than anything, was a lesson that had eluded her for years. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains and the cool night air began to settle in, the rancher stopped outside the cabin, his back to her as he surveyed the land. Aiyana stood in the doorway, watching him, her heart pounding with a strange, unfamiliar feeling. The rancher had been distant in a way that was both reassuring and painful. He had always been there, always willing to teach, to help, but never pushing for more. And she had been fine with that. Or at least, she told herself she was. But tonight, something shifted. Aiyana stepped out of the cabin, her boots crunching softly on the ground as she approached him. "You never talk about your past," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. The rancher didn't turn around at first. He stood there, his face shadowed by the fading light, his gaze fixed on the land stretching out before them. "There's nothing to talk about," he replied quietly, his voice steady but distant. Aiyana felt a knot form in her stomach. She had known there were parts of him he kept hidden, but hearing him say it so plainly made her heart ache. "You know," she began, her voice soft, "you don't have to hide from me. I don't know what happened to you, but I understand. We've both been running from something." The rancher's shoulders tensed, his jaw tightening slightly. He still didn't look at her. "I'm not hiding," he said, his tone flat. "I'm just moving forward." Aiyana's heart sank. "Is that all you're doing?" she asked, taking a step closer. "Just moving forward, no looking back." The rancher finally turned to face her, his eyes intense but unreadable. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low, as though the weight of his past was too heavy to carry any further. Aiyana took another step forward, closing the distance between them. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between the man he had become and the one he had left behind. "I understand more than you think," she said, her voice steady now. "We can't keep pretending our pasts don't exist. They shape who we are, but they don't have to define us." The rancher's gaze softened, and for the briefest moment, Aiyana saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. It was gone before she could fully grasp it, but it was enough to make her believe that he wasn't as far removed from her as he seemed. "I don't know if I'm ready to share everything," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "But I'm ready to fight. For you, for me, for us." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Aiyana's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure if she was ready to hear the whole truth, but she knew one thing. She couldn't keep running anymore. Not from him, not from herself. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly as it brushed against his arm. "We don't have to do this alone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The rancher looked at her for a long moment, his gaze searching, as if weighing something deep within himself. And then, finally, he nodded. "No," he said softly. "We don't." The silence stretched between them, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet understanding, an unspoken promise. Aiyana knew that they both had scars, but for the first time, she felt the weight of her own begin to lift. She wasn't running anymore, and neither was he. The sun had barely risen, but Aiyana was already awake, sitting near the fire, her thoughts as restless as the flames dancing before her. The night had passed without incident, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of calm. The storm of the previous days had cleared, both outside and inside her heart. The rancher's words lingered in her mind, a quiet promise of a future where they would no longer be hiding. She looked across the room at him, watching as he gathered his things with deliberate care. There was something different about him today, something softer in the way he moved, something unspoken hanging in the air between them. She had noticed it before, the way he seemed to carry the weight of his past, and how that past had shaped the man he had become. Aiyana knew there were things he had never shared, things he wasn't ready to talk about. But after the fight, after the night they had spent together, something had shifted between them. It was as if the walls they had both built over the years were beginning to crack. She stood up slowly, the cold morning air biting at her skin as she walked toward him. He didn't notice her approach until she was standing beside him. "We can't keep living like this," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence that had settled between them. The rancher paused, turning to look at her, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Aiyana hesitated for a moment, the words weighing on her tongue. "I don't want to keep running. I don't want to keep hiding." Her eyes met his, searching for any sign that he understood. The rancher's gaze softened, and for a moment, Aiyana saw something flicker in his eyes, something that mirrored the feeling growing inside her. "You don't have to run anymore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words settled in her chest like a balm, soothing the fears she hadn't even known she still carried. She had been running for so long that she had forgotten what it was like to stand still, to let the world catch up to her. But here, with him, she felt a shift, a possibility of something more. Something that didn't require constant movement, constant fear. The rancher stepped closer, the space between them narrowing as if the distance between them had never really existed. "We're not just surviving anymore," he said, his hand gently brushing against hers. "We're living. We can live without fear." Aiyana's breath caught in her throat. She had never allowed herself to think about what it would mean to truly live, to embrace the life she had been given. But here, with him, the idea felt real. It felt possible. She looked up at him, her heart racing in her chest. "What happens next?" she asked, her voice trembling with the weight of the question. The rancher smiled, a small, quiet smile that didn't reach his eyes, but it was enough to make Aiyana's heart flutter. "Next," he said, "we fight for what we want. Together." Aiyana didn't know if she was ready for what that would mean. She didn't know if she was ready for the challenges ahead, for the danger that still lurked in the shadows. But in that moment, she realized she didn't have to be. They were no longer just two people living in fear. They were partners now, bound by the choices they had made. And whatever came next, they would face it together. The rancher turned back toward the window, his eyes scanning the horizon. The land stretched out before them, wide and untamed, but it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like home, like a place where they could build something real. Aiyana stepped closer, her hand resting gently on his arm. "Together," she repeated, her voice steady now. The rancher turned to face her, and for the first time, Aiyana saw the depth of everything he had kept hidden, the pain, the loss, the regret, but also the hope, the possibility of a future where they could both move forward. "Together," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. They didn't need to say anything more. In that moment, everything had been said. The past had shaped them, but it no longer defined them. The future was theirs to create. Aiyana knew that the road ahead would be difficult, filled with obstacles and challenges. But she also knew that she wasn't alone anymore. She had the rancher by her side, and together, they would face whatever came their way. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the warmth wrapping around them like a promise of what was to come. They weren't running anymore. They weren't hiding. They were ready to live, ready to fight, ready to build something real. And for the first time in years, Aiyana felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: hope. The days that followed were a blur of preparation and hard work. The rancher and Aiyana moved with a shared purpose, each task bringing them closer to the future they had begun to build together. Aiyana's muscles ached from the long hours spent learning how to defend herself, how to handle a rifle, and how to read the land like the rancher did. It was all new to her. This life of fighting for something, not just running, but it was a life she could feel herself growing into. They spent their mornings working the land, their afternoons reinforcing the cabin, and their evenings sharpening their skills. It wasn't the life Aiyana had ever imagined, but for the first time, she could see the possibility of something more. There was a quiet strength between them, a bond that was beginning to grow stronger with each passing day. And yet, even as they worked side by side, there were moments when Aiyana felt the distance between them. The rancher had never spoken much about his past, and she hadn't pushed him to. But she couldn't help but wonder what had made him this way, what had shaped him into the man who stood before her, steadfast, unshaken, but always keeping a part of himself hidden. As the days turned into weeks, Aiyana found herself slowly letting go of the fear that had defined her for so long. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. But there was still something unsettled inside her, something she couldn't fully put into words. The rancher had never asked her about her past, either. He didn't press for details about the life she had left behind, and she hadn't volunteered much. But she knew the time was coming when they would have to face those truths. The quiet between them was both comforting and suffocating, and Aiyana wasn't sure how much longer she could live with the unspoken things between them. One evening, after a long day of work, the rancher stood by the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. Aiyana sat nearby, watching him in silence. The air was cool, but the warmth of the fire made the night feel bearable. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to simply relax, to not worry about what was to come. The rancher spoke first, breaking the stillness that had settled over them. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his voice low. "Is something on your mind?" Aiyana hesitated, unsure of what to say. She had been wrestling with her thoughts for days, but now that he had asked, she wasn't sure where to begin. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know if I'm ready for all of this. For what comes next." The rancher didn't say anything for a moment. Instead, he stood up and walked over to her, his footsteps muffled by the ground beneath him. He didn't look at her as he spoke, but his words were steady. "No one's ever ready for what comes next," he said quietly. "We just face it when it comes." Aiyana looked up at him, her heart racing. He was standing so close now, and she could feel the weight of his words sinking into her. She had been running from the future for so long, afraid of what would happen when she stopped. But now, with the rancher beside her, she realized she didn't have to face it alone. They were both haunted by the past, but they had a chance to build something new. She stood up, her legs a little shaky from the sudden movement, but she didn't care. "And what if we're not ready?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What if it all falls apart?" The rancher turned to face her fully, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "Then we rebuild," he said simply. "We fight for what we want, and we keep fighting until it's ours." His words hung in the air between them, thick with meaning. Aiyana felt a surge of something deep inside her, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. It was a quiet, fragile thing, but it was there. The fear she had carried for so long was starting to fade, replaced by something stronger. The rancher took a step closer to her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Aiyana looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "We've both got a lot to fight for," he said, his voice soft now. "But we don't have to fight alone." Aiyana's breath caught in her throat as she realized just how much those words meant. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for a life, for something more than just existing. For the first time in years, Aiyana felt like she was ready to face whatever came next, ready to take a step into the future instead of running from it. She took a deep breath, meeting the rancher's gaze. "Together," she said, her voice steady. "We fight together." The rancher nodded, his eyes softening. He didn't speak, but in that moment, there was no need for words. They were in this together, and that was enough. The days that followed were filled with steady, relentless progress. Aiyana and the rancher worked side by side, learning, preparing, and reinforcing their bond with each passing task. They spent their mornings with the land, clearing brush, mending fences, and gathering what they would need for the coming months. The evenings were spent in the cabin, working together to fortify their home against whatever might come their way. They were no longer just two individuals in the same place. They were a team, their lives intertwined by shared experience and the hard work that had brought them together. Aiyana no longer felt the weight of isolation that had once defined her. The fear that had kept her running was still there, but it was tempered now by the certainty that she had someone to fight with, someone who would stand beside her. She began to see a future beyond the endless cycle of survival, a future where she could make choices, where she could shape her own destiny. Yet, despite the progress, there was still something lingering between them, a quiet tension, an unspoken truth that neither had yet fully addressed. They had come to rely on each other, to trust each other, but there was still the past, the ghosts of what they had both endured, waiting to be acknowledged. One evening, as they sat by the fire after another long day of work, Aiyana glanced over at the rancher. His face was lit by the warm glow of the fire, but his expression was distant, as if lost in thought. She knew he was carrying something heavy inside him, something he wasn't ready to share. She had her own burdens, her own secrets, but for the first time, she didn't feel the need to carry them alone. "You know, you never talk about what happened before," she said softly, breaking the silence. "Before you came here." The rancher didn't look at her at first, but she could see his jaw tighten, the weight of his past pressing down on him. He was silent for a long time, and Aiyana wasn't sure if he would answer. But finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "There's not much to say," he said, his tone distant. "The past is the past. It doesn't matter anymore." Aiyana felt a pang of frustration. She understood the need to bury the past, to move forward, but she couldn't help but feel the distance between them grow. They couldn't keep ignoring what had shaped them. "But it does matter," she said, her voice a little sharper now. "It matters because it's who we are." The rancher met her gaze, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked, an unspoken understanding passing between them. He sighed, the tension leaving his shoulders as he looked down at his hands. "I didn't choose this life," he said quietly. "I didn't choose to be here, alone, hiding from my past. But sometimes, it's easier to live with the silence than to face what's behind it." Aiyana didn't know what he had been through, but she could see the pain in his eyes. She knew that silence wasn't the answer, not for her, not for him. They couldn't move forward without confronting what had shaped them. "You don't have to face it alone," she said softly, reaching out to place a hand on his. "Not anymore." The rancher looked up at her then, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper. Something that Aiyana couldn't quite name, but she recognized it all the same. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging something between them had shifted. And in that moment, Aiyana realized just how much they had both changed. They had gone from two people running from their past to two people willing to face it, together. As the fire crackled softly in the background, Aiyana felt a sense of peace settle over her. She wasn't running anymore. Neither of them were. They had found something real in each other, something worth fighting for. And for the first time in a long time, Aiyana allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could build something here. A life, a future, without fear, without looking back. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. They knew that. But they were no longer alone in it. Together, they could face whatever came their way. Together, they could make a new life. And that was enough.